Texas native Noli Ergas discovered green tea in his teens, researching and refining his palate from Arizona RTD convenience store cans to exquisite artisan works of art. After he moved to Japan, his professional journey in tea unfolded with the successful completion of the intense training required of a certified Japanese tea advisor. Noli, thanks a million for coming on the Tea Biz podcast. It's a joy to have you here talking tea.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, excited to be talking with someone who's been reporting on tea for probably since I was in grade school. So, yeah, very happy to be here.
What brought you to tea?
I grew up in Texas, so Southern sweet tea was something that I enjoyed. When I was in high school is when RTD became prominent in the U.S. So when Arizona green tea came on the market, that was my first exposure to green tea. Someone in high school told me that, oh, white tea and green tea and black tea are all from the same plant. And that was just like, mind blown moment. Yeah. And then fast forward, I moved to Japan, lived in Japan and worked as a school teacher in the public schools. There would be tea served to you once in the morning and once after lunch. And so I just got this green tea put in front of me, not knowing what it was, but unsweetened and very green. And so I got accustomed to drinking that every day. Coming back from Japan, living in the US, I started to miss that a little bit and started seeking tea on my own. In 2013, I returned from living in Japan for the last time. That was the third of 3 different times living there. I just wanted to work with a Japanese company to use my Japanese language and cultural knowledge. And it happened that Sugimoto Tea Company was hiring. And I come from an academic background. I was on track to be a PhD in paleontology before I shifted gears and went the way of the East. When I started, there was not much business-wise for Sugimoto in the U.S. So I had a lot of time to do research. And then my boss, Kyohei Sugimoto, he recommended, or at least threw it out there, that I could, if I was interested, pursue getting the Japanese Tea Advisor certification from the Japanese Tea Instructors Association, which I have come to find is, now being in the tea industry many years, is one of the most rigorous tea certifications you can possibly get. I didn't realize at the time because I wasn't familiar with tea certifications, but that was a very rigorous and great introduction into what it takes to actually cultivate tea and process tea, at least in the Japanese style.
Japanese growers deliver precise amounts of uniformly processed intermediary leaves that are finished by processing specialists using different techniques and styles. In most instances, they've created a distinctive process that manifests as a brand. The hojicha sold at auction might end up being blended into 15 brands.
I actually like the term that you're using, 2-tier production. It's actually not something that I was familiar with, but I think it explains the Japanese production pretty well. Greatly simplified, what this means is that unlike some origins where a certain person or family may grow the tea, harvest it, process it, and then send out a finished product that is from that one growing estate, in Japan, it's most common that a farm will grow the tea and then do the initial processing that must be done to make it a green tea, which is that kill green phase, which is achieved by steaming. And then critical to most Japanese tea is that there needs to be rolling while drying. And that will produce something called aracha, which translates as crude tea. And then this gets traded. And a tea maker, like I work with Sugimoto Tea Company, or in Japan, Sugimoto Seicha, which literally translates as Sugimoto Tea Makers. A company like ours will then buy this crude tea, which is not ready for the market. It's too high a moisture content. It's unsorted. It's unfinished. The shelf life would be too low before, it starts going bad. So we take that tea and then we blend with aracha, or this crude tea from other farms, and then do additional processing, which includes things like sorting and further application of heat and the blending, of course. And then we come up with a finished product that should be consistent over the years. And not only do we come up with a finished product, generally it's going to be sencha, if you're taking aracha that's been rolled while drying. But from the same aracha, the same crude tea, we can make sencha, we can make kukicha, genmaicha, hojicha, konacha, and some other ancillary tea types. So what the farmer provides is just one thing, this aracha, and then what we finally create is many different finished teas. Now that's the sencha system. For matcha, it's a bit different in that it's crucial that the tea leaves, once steamed, are not rolled while drying. So they will be more blow dried and then like convection oven baked. And then that's when you have the tencha aracha, tencha being the loose leaf precursor to matcha. And that's something that we will then purchase and blend and further refine to remove the stems and the leaf veins. And then we chop, blend, and mill into matcha in the end. So that's the hopefully pretty simplified two-tier production system. In reality, usually in between the farm and the tea maker is the government auction house, which is what most tea makers participate in, where all the farmers take their tea leaves to market, and a representative from the tea maker will then bid on which lots they want. That's something that we have sidestepped many decades ago and worked directly with the farms.
What are the advantages of buying directly from tea farms?
Well, in Japan, it's, for one, massive tea estates are basically non-existent. So Japan is a lot more cut up. Farmers' fields may be completely geographically isolated from each other, where they drive to one field and they have to drive to another field, because it's a country with a very long history and the whole layout of the land is rather patchwork at this point in terms of property ownership. So it's kind of tricky to talk about estates. I mean, it's basically whatever land that a certain farmer either owns or is leasing to grow the tea. And it does happen that there are folks who maybe have some plots of tea, but then they also have plots of potatoes and they have plots of rice. So something that our company leadership decided a little over a decade ago is that we really wanted to focus on organic matcha production. I think that was a keen insight that either my boss and or his father had at the time, because it really was the bulk of the demand in the US market and in the European market. So now we work with 5 different farms and farming cooperatives that we source our aracha tencha from, and then we blend as necessary. Currently we have 5 grades of organic matcha, and then for conventional or non-organic matcha, we have a lot more.
At the beginning of the 20th century, Japan was an export powerhouse, supplying most of the world's green tea. However, from the 1950s to the 1970s, Japan exported little or no tea. The domestic market consumed the entire harvest. Tea imports grew to 9 million kilos in 1974. There were 53,687 commercial tea farms in the year 2000. Domestic tea production peaked at 100 million kilos in 2004 and has gradually declined since. There are fewer than 20,000 farms today, while tea exports are at record highs.
Let me give a brief arc of the or trade of tea outside of Japan, because it does give it is, I think, very helpful in painting the picture of where the Japanese tea industry is now. Well, pre 1853, Japan was growing its own tea. It was consuming its own tea. There was not, it basically had only established trade with the Portuguese and a little bit with the Dutch. And in 1853 is when Matthew Perry of the U.S. Navy marched into Japan, well, sailed into Japan and basically demanded that Japan start opening with trade to other Western countries, namely the U.S. And Japan, slowly, but by 1868, really was just all out producing tea for export to the U.S. And that was basically to please the palates of largely Midwesterners, people in the West Coast and in the Midwest, the Chicago area, Wisconsin, Minnesota, all were very thirsty for Japanese green tea. And you actually had both Americans and Chinese who were running the factories, to help make the Japanese tea to the U.S. palate's liking. And that continued basically just a lot of steam tea, of course, but pan-fired tea was also very regularly coming out of Japan at that time. And then black tea started being exported like 1870s. So, the Japan export market was like, these are the teas for overseas, and then these other teas are what we're gonna make to our liking, we're gonna consume here. And that continued basically until, Japan kind of fell out of favor leading up to World War II. And, the export market really took a major hit, halted for a while, and then was slow to recover afterwards. So after that, I mean, Japanese tea exports, particularly to the U.S., were kind of a trickle. And the Japanese were slowly seeking higher quality teas themselves, because Japan was very much a peasant class, warrior class, ruling class kind of stratified society where the common people didn't get to drink nice teas like sencha. So the 20th century was really the commoners of Japan catching up to that and getting to consume nicer and nicer teas through the years, culminating with the bubble economy of the 1980s, where people in Japan were spending lavishly. If you wanted to drink the finest tea in the land, then you sought the finest tea in the land and you drank that. If you wanted a $300,000 stone for your garden, then you went and you bought that. Like, there was just money flying everywhere in Japan. In the tea industry, there was a saying that if you make tea, you make money. It was as simple as that. And that was when, adjusted for modern day values, that was the time when the average cost per kilo of Japanese tea was at its highest that it's ever been. And it's been a steady decline since then, and more precipitous decline in the past couple of decades. So the Japanese tea industry has really been struggling, as the Japanese economy has not really recovered fully from the bubble economy of the 80s, combined with now amongst younger Japanese people, looking towards what your grandparents are doing or your older parents, depending on your age bracket. Whatever they are doing is uncool, and whatever the West is doing is cool. So coffee consumption has nearly outpaced tea consumption in Japan. Obviously, beer in favor of sake is becoming more and more common. And so tea in Japan, and with RTD, the development of RTD in the 1970s, Japanese tea, in particular artisanal Japanese tea, has been in steady decline. And so coming back to what you were talking about matcha's popularity, that's really been kind of a godsend for the Japanese tea industry. And I say kind of because there's some complicating factors. Like typically a factory in Japan would be set up for making loose leaf tea or making matcha. And there were not many who were doing both. But according to the market demands, companies such as Sugimoto Tea Company, we were doing basically exclusively loose leaf teas up until the 2000s, probably about 2010. And then as matcha slowly began to rise in popularity, we shifted to making matcha. And boy, our exports of matcha from Japan have gone from where I started in 2013. We were doing maybe 100 kilos exporting of matcha a year, maybe probably less than that, to now doing like upwards of 100 tons of matcha that are being produced and exported. That's like what, 1,000-fold increase in matcha that we've been producing and moving. So obviously that's helping a lot of Japanese farmers, particularly those who had the forethought or foresight to switch to organic farming methods. But the farmers who are making the more traditional artisanal loose leaf teas like higher end senchas or gyokuro, they were still struggling and continue to struggle. But that's something that we're also kind of tackling and offering more varieties of specialty grades of sencha and gyokuro. I implemented the single cultivar series where we showcase one given cultivar and process it as a sencha. And we kind of cycle through about 3 or 4 different cultivars per year. I introduced that in 2018. And now we're trying to also showcase some of the other types of tea that are not as common, but produced in Japan, like Japanese oolong, wakocha, the Japanese black tea, and pan-fired green tea, kamairicha. So, yeah, there's a lot of artisanal teas still being made in Japan, and hopefully with increased interest from the foreign markets, those farmers are going to continue to make basically works of art with their tea.
What's the next big thing in Japanese tea? I'm primarily thinking of teas exported to the West.
And before I talk about the other teas, even within matcha, I would say we've seen a giant shift, but the demand was mostly for the more economical grades of matcha, like, the lowest of the culinary grades. As much as we tried promoting the finer ceremonial grades, the demand was really for the cheaper stuff. And I've seen a big shift in the last 10 years where there's a lot more demand for the ceremonial grades now, and also people who might have been purchasing our most economical culinary in the past, stepping up a grade just to offer a better product. What might be the next big thing, or what might be the next trend in Japanese tea? Within Japan, I think hojicha, the roasted green tea, is moving into a limelight. And whether that's going to be a limelight that's going to last, for minutes on the economical timeline, or if it's going to endure in the way that matcha has, is to be seen. But one nice thing about hojicha is that, well, one, it's very different from matcha. So a lot of people get turned off by Japanese teas because they're so green, and people don't like the grassiness, the vegetalness, the bitterness that especially will be noticeable in more economical teas. So hojicha provides a great counterpoint to that. It's brown, not green, although it's still a green tea because of how it's processed. It's got that kind of roasty, toasty aroma that coffee would offer. Still, it's an aroma of tea, but it goes well alongside coffee and chocolate and those kinds of roasted dark brown agricultural products. And a lot of makers mill the hojicha to make a hojicha powder, which you can then used in all the same applications that matcha would be used in, such as baking or making lattes, or sprinkling as a topping on desserts. So it has all the versatility of matcha, but a very distinctly different flavor that appeals to people who, may find that green flavor of the more common Japanese teas off-putting.
Now, that's a good point.
Yeah, I think the palates of the East, particularly Japan, has become more in line with the West. And on the reverse side, I think palates of the West have become a little more in line with the palates of the East. I feel like there's been sort of this narrowing of the gap of what used to be like, oh, this appeals to the Japanese tastes, this appeals to American tastes. And now, especially the younger Japanese people are wanting things that are more mild, more sweet. Hojicha has been great filling that space because it lacks a lot of the catechins, and has less caffeine, so therefore less bitterness, less astringency. And especially when prepared as a latte, as you can find in 7-Eleven and ready to drink cartons, and you can find in Starbucks in Japan. The hojicha latte is a really, really approachable beverage, especially if it's sweetened. So it's been gaining a lot of traction in Japan, and we've also been seeing it gain a bit of traction here in the US. The really grassy teas that became prevalent in Japan amongst Japanese tea industry have been on the decline.
Produced by Adavita Studios. Connect your voice to the world.